Okay, great. So here we are, and I see everybody. Well, thanks everybody for being here. And I am, we're going to talk about hard stories today, stories that have trauma, but they're also the opportunity for healing, perhaps. And what I want to do is spend some time talking with you about, hey, whenever there are divisions and separation and stereotypes, and also where powerful emotions are present, well, bottom line, somebody's pain is involved, and we all have hard stories to share because we've all been through hard times. So this is really about all of us. But as story professionals, how do we handle the hard stories that people share to us, right? So inquiring minds want to know. So here's a little bit about me. There's a link to my website. Send me an email. I would love to hear from you. And so, our purpose today is just a couple things. Well, whether others or you have been silenced, harassed, neglected, abandoned, abused, whatever all those things and challenges are that you have experienced, working with hard stories is vital because that's when stereotypes and separation and pain begin dissolving and when connection actually starts to happen. And it's this is a really important point, it's also within these hard stories that new understandings can happen and solutions emerge to some of our most pressing problems that we face today. So learning more about hard stories and learning how to work with them is extremely valuable, whether you're in business or a nonprofit or just in general as a story professional, to enhance and expand your skills. And I love, Doug Littman just shared this a few weeks ago with me. And he said, yes, he reminded me, a sorrow shared is a sorrow halved. And so simply the act of sharing and being a compassionate listener to a hard or traumatic story has great value in and of itself. But of course, we want to know how to listen and share these hard stories. And there are well-defined steps to go through, which I'll share with you today. So that's that saying. Forgot to advance the slide. There we go. So how did I come to this place anyway? Well, I started working with stories decades ago in organizations around change projects. And I used stories as a diagnostic. And I learned through that what was working and what was broken, where communication breakdowns were happening, and what the organization's strengths were. But also, I was learning at the same time how stories, when shared, dissolve stereotypes and silos, calm warring factions, and actually build relationships. Well, then I moved over into working a lot more with leaders, and I found myself focused on stories about something positive that came out of something negative, right? These are lessons learned stories and mistakes and tragedies and disasters, all sorts of stories like that. And it was always to build trust, both within the leader himself and with others, but also authenticity. In other words, being able to share the story instead of hiding it. And then as a result, building more powerful connections. It also helped dissolve stereotypes, their own and others' stereotypes, and to build bridges with staff, but also to model effective leadership. Well, this also then eventually morphed into helping communities and nonprofits with traumatized people, racked by human trafficking, drive-by shootings, drug dealing, prostitution, homelessness, gangs, and all of that, to tell their stories, to dissolve stereotypes and build bridges. Now, actually, I'm a folklorist. I have a doctorate in folklore. So I was doing this kind of work early on in my folklore career, and then found myself actually doing the same work in businesses and having projects where I was having to go into communities that were impoverished, experienced extreme racism, and to help bring them to the table so that solutions could be found. And so I've had a lot of experience working with all different types of populations where painful, hard, traumatic stories are present. And I've spent, maybe about 8, 9, 10 years working with former foster youth and also survivors of human trafficking to tell their stories in ways that are really helpful to them and to others. So that's a little bit about how I came here to talk to you about this. So, no matter where you are in an organization or a community, right? The likelihood that you're going to be working and dealing with hard stories is quite high. So whether it's from the shop floor or the secretarial pool, though we have some reactions when we hear these stories. And the most common reactions are, one, I don't want to hear these stories. Or I am too overwhelmed by these stories. Or I get too emotional when I hear these stories. Or I don't even know what to do with these stories once somebody tells them to me. But I want to share first that you don't have to fix anything or defend anything to be helpful. Just being a compassionate listener is 90% of the work and keeps you from feeling helpless. And this is where the magic begins, when you are simply a compassionate listener. The magic for yourself and for others, the person sharing the story with you. So let's keep going. I will tell you also that I'm not a therapist. And when I started to work as a story professional with people who were had experienced a lot of trauma, I had social worker and therapist friends who said, wait, that's our work, right? And I said, well, but my focus is really just about the story piece so that they can stand up and deliver that story in any situation. And these stories are often very hard for people to get their heads wrapped around because they're big stories. I mean, I'm talking about the teller who experienced whatever painful happening, in their life. And so I kept talking with them. They kept talking to me, and I would share what I was doing and how I was working with folks. And finally, after about a year of being in conversation, they said, yeah, Karen, you're doing good work. Just keep going, right? And so I have, right? But I'm very clear I'm not a therapist, and some people need therapy and they need to go there. But if they're at a place where they can start working on their story, then I can definitely help them. I'm going to share with you my process for doing all of this today while we are here. Well, so your opportunity really is to help people find their voice. And so also, I will say that I've experienced over and over again that through their story, the story that you hear, they will tell you what they really need and not what you think that they need. And that innovative solutions can emerge once you've heard these stories. And I have so many stories I could share with you about working in these areas, but I'm very focused on our time. I don't want to run over. I want to leave time for questions afterwards. And if there's an opportunity, I'll share, one or two of these stories, either with leaders or with communities, so that we can put more flesh to the bones. But we will continue on. So the outcomes, are basically this. You'll know by the end of our time together, the story process to use, around these hard stories to give people a voice, to build bridges, to dissolve stereotypes, whether you're in business, whether you're a nonprofit, or working directly with communities who are suffering. So let's begin and get into the heart of what we want to talk about, which is the how. But first, imagine, right? Imagine that there are two people sitting together and you're the facilitator. These people are strangers. Either they've got vastly different jobs, income, ages, racial background, and experiences, or differences in status. They're most foreign to each other in ethnicity or nationality, and outlook, point of view, beliefs, attitudes, or they are survivors, of their upbringing, of disaster, war, illness, they're a veteran, assault, whatever, right? How do you listen to their stories? And how do they listen to their stories? And how do they tell their stories? And how do you help them tell their stories? So the first step, right, is asking yourself some questions. Are you willing to hear something traumatic? Maybe, maybe not. Are you willing to learn something new? Are you willing to hear what they have to say and their point of view? If yes or maybe, right, then let's continue. The how. Getting into it. So the first thing, when, as a story professional, we're helping somebody with a hard story, the first thing to do is to set the space. Now, there are 4 things to do to set the space. I'm going to go through each one of them. The first one is your focus. The second one is their intentions and your intentions. Then the third one is your role and outcomes. And then the fourth are my 3 rules, the 3 rules that I've developed. So let's talk about focus first. So I find that when I maintain the focus, as I'm listening to a hard story, if I maintain the focus of finding moments or people that got the teller through and made a difference for them, then the pain and trauma that they experience just passes right through me, right? So I end up not getting caught up in the details of what happened to them, although that's important. I need to, help document that. But really, my focus is to find the moments or the people that got them through the experience, or those moments and people that made a difference for them. So the second one is intentions. Now, not everybody has the opportunity when working with a hard story or listening to a hard story of talking about intentions. But if you do, then here's what to do and why. It's very freeing to talk about intentions. When you get to have a conversation, now that conversation about intentions really depends on the situation, the people, and your gut feeling. Can we really talk about them? Or does intentions, talking about that, happen later? But you get to have a conversation with them about, well, what's your intention for telling this story? What do you want to have happen? Excuse me, I'm going to need to cough. Okay, thank you. The air is very dry here. So thank you for being patient. So what's their intention for telling the story? What do they want to have happen? What stereotypes or misinformation do you want to dissolve? And what's the most important thing for your listener to know by the time you finish telling your story? And it also is, as a story professional or practitioner, what is my intention when listening to this story? What do I want to have happen? And then you get an opportunity to discuss the goals. Like, perhaps a goal could be, now I'll have a way to talk about the experience. They'll have maybe a goal of how they want the audience to feel. Maybe a goal is the length of the time of the story. Usually I'm constrained in about 10 minutes, right? So there's a time constraint I usually am dealing with. And then maybe another goal is to have them learn story skills so that they can take any part of their story and tell it well and feel good about it. So these are the kinds of things you want to have, the conversations you want to have, the topics you want to discuss when you're focusing on intentions. And again, we're still setting the space. And then we'll talk about the 3 rules in a minute. But also we need to first talk about your roles and the outcomes. Now, I will say right now that there are unrealistic outcomes. Like, oh yes, your outcome here by telling your story, the healing will happen, or transformation, or change, or enlightenment. But if we focus on those as outcomes, well, then it's very easy to force those outcomes and not really pay attention to the dynamics of what's going on in the telling of the story. And so I call those unrealistic outcomes. We set those aside. Right? What we do want to focus on are realistic outcomes, right? Has the person felt seen, heard, valued, and empowered? If I can have that as any one of those as an outcome, then there's a greater likelihood that healing and transformation, all that kind of good stuff can happen, but that's not really the focus, right? And that's not my role. My role is to make sure that the teller who is sharing that hard story feels seen, heard, valued, and empowered. Now, my role, right? So what's my role? And this I've developed over the years I've been working with hard stories. And I've discovered that for myself, my role is to simply experience their magnificence as they share the story. Now, someone asked me a few years ago, Karen, how can you continue to listen to all these stories after stories after stories of very traumatic happenings in people's lives? And I said, well, really, I think what I know to be true about myself is that as I'm listening to their story, if my whole focus and demeanor and attitude and behavior is on me experiencing their magnificence, then none of those stories stick to me, right? I'm not carrying those traumas around with me. And so I encourage you to find your role, right? Maybe it's honoring. Maybe it's esteeming. And maybe it's just being a witness. It's exceptionally powerful, just being the witness to what happened to them. Maybe the focus is beauty, right? The beauty that you can find in the story, or just appreciations for who they really are, what they've come through, and where they are today. So I think this is a very powerful slide to spend some time with and to ask yourself a few questions about. Now let's get to these 3 rules. So the 3 rules I have developed over time in working with these hard stories is that, first of all, the teller owns the story. they get to pick and choose what to share about, right? That's not me. I'm not the story practitioner or professional who's telling them, here's how to craft your story. It has to have this and this and this in it. No, they get to choose what to pick and tell about. I've had people who say, okay, I had all of these things happening to me growing up that were just absolutely horrible, but I don't want to start the story until I graduated from high school. That's where I want to start the story. Great. Let's go for it. My second rule is no re-traumatizing the teller. So as they are telling the story, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. If they're telling the story and they get to a place where they start breaking down or it's too hard for them, right? We find different ways for them to tell the story so that they are not re-traumatized every time they're telling the story. And I had one client, a survivor of human trafficking, who said to me after we'd worked on her story and she delivered her story to a big audience at a conference, she said a few days later when I talked to her, Karen, this is the first time in 7, 8 years where I haven't needed to go to bed for 3 days after telling my story. No, she felt alive and energized and quite proud of the story that she told. So great, no re-traumatizing the teller. And then also no traumatizing the audience. Because very often I see people who've been asked to tell their stories and on stage, and they share too much, right? And the audience becomes traumatized and, walks out of the event with not feeling very good at all. So those are my 3 rules. They own the story, no re-traumatizing the teller, and no traumatizing the audience. So I should say that this goes a long way. I'm going to go back a slide. These 3 rules. These 3 rules really help avoid victim or what's called victim or nonprofit porn, right? This is where the parading of trauma happens, where there's emotional exploitation of the teller, right? So you're either displaying emotions for the benefit of the organization, like let's get that emotional hook in there so that you can raise money, right? Or there's emotional manipulation of the story, right? And of the teller. So I'll tell my story so I can continue to receive benefits from the nonprofit or the social service agency, or I'll still be able to have my job, right? So, or I'll tell for the organization's benefit and I'll be liked and valued, right? There will be approval. But this is the power that the organization or a story consultant still holds over the person. And so we have to be very, very careful and cognizant, aware, right, of this victim porn. That's a word, that's a term that actually survivors of severe trauma, right, they use. Right, and they do not want to be victimized again by the telling of their story. So just FYI. So let's continue now. Let's learn a bit more about listening to the story. And anybody who knows my work knows that I'm a big advocate of story listening. So how do we do it here? In this case, where we are working with hard stories. So for the listener, that's you, the story practitioner, you want to kick back, get ready to listen deeply, right, with your full attention. Don't interrupt. There are a couple exceptions I'm going to talk about, and then do take notes, but there's a particular way to take notes. So again, interrupting. Again, that depends on the situation and the person and your gut feeling. But the general rule of thumb is don't interrupt unless they have difficulty telling a part of their story, or gently interrupt them if it's important to ask them how they felt or what got them through that particular part of their story, that particular experience. And you can gently interrupt the story and ask them, well, what got you through that time? Or if a part is really painful and they can't get through it, you can interrupt and simply tell them they don't have to share that, or they don't have to share all the details. If they think it's critical to share this part of the story, then help them find a way to tell it. Offer 2 to 3 suggestions, like, if you don't want to share the details, what's the most important to share? Or let's find some different words for you to use to not trigger them, right? Or instead of sharing all of the details, would it help you and be okay if you simply said, and then maybe offer a paraphrase? So that's the little thing about it, in not interrupting and exceptions. And also, this is a way to not re-traumatize the teller in the telling of their story. And then taking notes. You definitely want to take notes, but as long as you still maintain eye contact. So this may take some practice of maintaining eye contact, taking a few notes, going back to eye contact, taking a few notes. But the one thing you don't want to do is just be looking down at your paper all the time that they're telling and taking notes, right? That's not going to work. And then after you have done that listening, you're going to want to give appreciations. Now, usually we give appreciations later in the process when we're just working with regular stories, but with hard stories, we want to do something different. We want to give appreciations right after they finish telling the story, right? All the moments that impacted you and why, what you love about the story, the stereotypes, myths, and apprehensions they were able to dissolve, any of these, right? These are just a list for you to kind of help you along. And then the third step is to ask reflective questions. Right? So how was that? What did you like about the story? What are you most proud of? And really to actually start asking questions about the key message. Like, now that you've experienced, shared this experience with me, what does it mean to you? Right? And after you shared a story with the listener, what is the final thought you want to leave them with? So this helps, again, focus the story. Now then, the fourth step is to retell the story back to them. Use your notes. Test the key message. Discuss their reactions, what they liked, what they could change. Point out the parts you really liked. Have them upgrade the draft so that it's in their own words and they can add missing information. So that's it. That's basically the process, right? So we can start wrapping this up and get over to Q&A. Again, your opportunity, as we said in the beginning, by following these steps in this process, you'll give people a voice. And of course, as I expect you, as you work with these steps and this process, you refine it for yourself. Right? That's, of course, what happens. But this is a structure that help you get started. So help give people a voice. It will definitely help dissolve stereotypes and bridge those divisions that are occurring, and maybe discover something new, right? A solution or an innovation for what they really need. So let's talk about some next steps that you can take. Just 3 simple things that you can, steps you can take tomorrow, and action steps. So one thing is you could simply share something that you learned today, or you could ask yourself what inspires you about working with stories this way. You could seek an opportunity to actually listen to a hard story and use the process. You could test the process out with a trusted friend. Keep testing, and practicing, and just keep going, right? So I encourage you, right, to take action as soon as you can on this. So to review, what we did is we talked about the what. These are hard stories. Why hard stories are important. We talked about the how, the rules, the process, which is setting the space, listening, reflective questions, telling the story back to them, next steps. And so here we are. Time for Q&A, time to chat for a bit. And so Artem, why, I'm done here. Why don't we open it up? And I don't need to see the slides anymore.
Yep.
There we are.
What a great talk. And let me tell you just before the questions, I really enjoy how you are humble to say that you are not speaking from the points of therapy, but I really can recognize I'm not a therapist too. I've merely read some books by Michael White, and what I recognize is a lot of what you say resonates with narrative practice, especially the meaning making part and not traumatizing people again. So thank you so much. This is lovely. We have a question here from Roseanne. How do we distinguish between having the audience emotionally moved, touched versus traumatized?
Ask that again, Artem.
Yes, of course. How do we distinguish between having the audience emotionally moved or touched and versus traumatized?
Well, that's a great question. So what I noticed is that as someone is telling me a story and all of the details of the trauma are being told, I get a sense, it's just my intuitive sense. Oh no, that's too much for the audience. And so when we get to the point where we're crafting the story, then I may make that point. I don't think the audience can hear all of that. They can hear some of that. So what parts do you think are the most important to tell? Right? And my experience says that once I help somebody set a little boundary of, okay, this is maybe a bit much, they do pick the details that they feel are the most important, and they start developing their own sense of the audience. So yeah, okay, the audience can't listen to all of this, right? And so use your sense. You're a story professional, right? How much the audience can take based on how much you can take, right? And so just follow your gut instincts about that, and you'll be fine. Actually, you'll know. And that's why I encourage you to try this out with somebody and practice the process so you can develop those sensibilities.
Great. I hope, Roseanne, that answers your question. And we've got one more from Esther, who is about to join us on air next. So let me read it out loud. What is the role of advising, or I guess advice giving, in trauma story listening?
Of advice giving? What's the role of advice giving? Don't. And there's a difference between giving advice and offering suggestions, right? Although now, as I'm saying that, I'm kind of remembering, yes, there are times when I have had to give advice. Like, okay, I don't think the audience can hear all of those details. So how do you want to handle that, right? And then if they're lost, I can offer a suggestion. Or I might give them some advice in the very setup, like when we were creating that space. Then I talk about the rules. I said, you get to share the story, right? And the way you want to. You don't have to talk about anything. I'm not going to make you talk about anything, right? Unless you want to. So those are little pieces of advice, but I'm not really trying to put the story in a formula, right? And advise them on that. I'm just really trying to have it grow out organically from our work together. So less advice, more suggestions.
Love your spirit. And as a psychologist, we've been told not to give advice, even back at the guessing the bachelor's degree. So I'm totally with you on that one. And there is another question from Marina. So as much as you can go into it, because she's asking, as a professional narrative practitioner, how can we stop re-traumatizing during the talk? And she's talking about re-traumatizing somebody as a listener.
Mm-hmm. Re-traumatizing somebody as a listener, right? So that's similar to the first question, right? So how? Or are you asking personally? Do you think you, as a story practitioner, not being traumatized? So. Yeah. Okay, so that makes sense. Well, I know this sounds sort of hard to grasp, but I find that when I choose that role of being the story professional who is only going to see and view and experience the magnificence of who they are as they tell the story, I find that I'm not traumatized by anything that they tell me. I mean, let's be honest, they are survivors. They made it through, right? They're there in front of you, right? Sharing a very painful experience. And so if I allow myself to get pulled into that trauma, then I can't do the work. If I come from the place of, I'm only going to, and this is what I tell myself, and this is how I set it up for myself. In spite of everything that happened, there were some amazing things that happened to you, and that you are a magnificent person just for making it through. And I want to find those qualities. I want to find those moments, right, where you made a decision and got yourself through. Like when a survivor of human trafficking was sharing her story, she had an experience at 5 years old when she was camping with her grandmother of just being filled with light. And that experience stayed with her even to the present day. And in the worst part of her experiences, she always could rely on that image and that experience she had of her true nature was being filled with light, not the horrific situation and exploitation she was finding herself in, and which can truly destroy somebody's soul. That is a moment of magnificence, right? That says something about her ability as a human being. And my experiences is that most of the people who have gone through areas of events that are very traumatic, there's been something that has gotten them through. Or some person that said, I know you can handle this, or I know you'll be okay. Right? that allowed them a moment to just continue, and moving forward and getting themselves out of the situation. And so that's what is energizing and keeps everyone moving forward. So I hope that helps.
I hope too. You just gave me a metaphor that I would like to share before asking you this final question. I believe that we both, like story practitioners, have something in common with the people who are doing the narrative practice or the psychotherapeutic work. In a sense, there is an art of kintsugi where you assemble pieces of broken glass, maybe a teapot or like a cup, and you paint them with gold and you keep it like that. So what I believe we are doing is that we bring the gold so the person can stick them together, but we never aim for the deeper job where the person has to pick up the shards firsthand and maybe cut in the process. And that's way, way deeper, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess those are parts of the same process. And I love how you explained your territory on this and your stance, which is really adding to what there is in practice. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. I love your analogy because I love that that part of art making, and storytelling is an art form, right? And
Exactly.
so it fits perfectly with what we've been talking about. Yes. Thank you for sharing that.
Karen, it's been a pleasure. One final question. Yes, and I agree with Esther. You did it again, the amazing Karen Dietz. One final question. So, by coming to this conference, you've been proving the meaning that people can come together for a noble cause. So, what's one more meaning like this statement that you would like people to get inspired about for us to live in the world with more bridges?
Well, I think as a world, we are facing so many problems whose root is separation and stereotypes about other people and the hatred that can bring out in us. And I think one of the only ways to really start building bridges and dissolving those stereotypes and connecting with others is through listening to stories. But that's hard because these are often hard stories that people are going to share with you. So my brother survived Hurricane Ian, who went through Florida, and he survived. He and his wife in the house were fine, but all around them was complete, utter devastation. And he went out to help his neighbors, and he would ask them, "Well, how can I help you? How can I help you?" And they would say, "Oh, I don't know. I know we're fine. We're fine." When you know that they're not, right? And I said, "Oh, you just need to be willing to listen to their stories." But he couldn't because he didn't know the process for doing that. And he didn't know how to listen and not be traumatized by the stories themselves, right? So none of that happened. And as a result, he wasn't able to help people in a way that was meaningful to them by simply just listening to their stories. And so I offer this process as a way for my brother and for anybody else, right, to be able to just listen and listen in a good way, right? So anyway, that's that.
Thank you so much, Karen. I totally agree with Anna, who's writing that. It was strong, a deep experience from a huge-hearted professional who is getting all of our fires, I guess. Let's support Karen for being here.
Oh,
You're such a gift.
thank you so much. Right back to you, Artem. You are such a gift. So thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we will be moving forward, and our next speaker is already here with us.